is called back to take over the Shalit file. How do you make contact with a Mossad person in the 21st century? Facebook. Hagai Hadass. There's his picture. The same picture in the newspaper. Almost no information about him, but he says that he lives in the town of Maccabim, just a small village outside of Modi'in. Pick up telephone information service. Hagai Hadass, Maccabim, please. They give me his home phone number. I call his home phone number. He's not at home. His daughter answers the phone. Can I have Abba's cell phone number, please? Sure. I call up Hagai Hadass and introduce myself to him, tell him what I've been doing. He says, thank you very much. We don't need your help. We have a German mediator. Don't interfere. That was the mantra I would hear over the next 2 years. In the meantime, the German track is advancing. Hadass pushes Netanyahu to accept the track of the German mediator, Dr. Conrad. Ahmed Jabri, the strongman of Hamas, the one who committed the military coup, the chief of staff of the Hamas military force, the Ezzedin al-Qassam, is responsible for holding Shalit and in charge of the negotiations. He appoints Mahmoud Zahar, the foreign minister of Hamas, to be in charge of the negotiations. Zahar and Conrad, the German, become very close personal friends. When I heard that, I thought that a breakthrough was coming, because in a situation where there's zero trust, if the key negotiator and the key guy from the Hamas side have become friends, that's an element that we can build on to bring about an agreement. And on October 2nd, on the eve of Yom Kippur, 2009, Israeli television had already shut down for Kol Nidrei. We heard rumors that there was a videotape of Gilad Shalit. And we heard on the radio, before it went off the air for Yom Kippur, that we were coming back on television. And on television, the nation watched this videotape, 2 minutes long, of Gilad Shalit, speaking, standing up, walking, holding a newspaper with a date. This was the best Yom Kippur I ever had. I was convinced, knowing Hamas, that if they issued a videotape, we were on the verge of an agreement, and immediately after Yom Kippur, we would hear about the deal being made, and Gilad Shalit would soon be coming home. But then there was no progress. Conrad made more than 50 trips back and forth, disappearing for periods of time in between. He came back in November with a first draft agreement. Hamas rejected the agreement. He came back a month later with a second draft agreement. This time, Ahmed Jabri took the agreement, tore it off, threw out Conrad, told him not to come back, fired Mahmoud Zahar from the negotiations, and that was the end. That was the end of the German track. The Israeli response was, there's a German draft agreement, we accept it. Netanyahu went to the public, convenes a press conference, and tells the people of Israel that there's a deal on the table that Israel is willing to accept. We have red lines. There are people that we will not release, but Israel is doing everything possible to bring Gilad Shalit home. Now we're waiting for a response from Hamas. And this is what I heard over the next months. There's a deal on the table. There's a German negotiator. We're waiting for a response from Hamas. But I knew from the Hamas side that Jabri fired Conrad, he fired Jabri, he tore up the agreement. He was not willing to accept whatever was there, for whatever reason was there, that I only discovered 2 years later what was the reason. In the meantime, no negotiations. I decided once again that I have to try and get something started. I heard from the Shalits that no negotiations are going on. I'm hearing from the Hamas people that no negotiations going on. Hagai Hadass, who refuses to talk to me, will only text me, tells me there's a German negotiator, stay out. I knew the intelligence officer at the Russian embassy. I went to see him. and asked the Russians if they would be willing to step in and take over the negotiations. The intelligence officer flies off to Moscow, meets with Putin, comes back and gives me an answer that if Israel and the Hamas both ask them to do it, and they're the only mediators in town, they're willing to step in and take over the negotiations. I further had proposed that the Russians should invite the two parties to go to Russia and stay in some isolated location until they come up with an agreement. But neither Israel nor Hamas were willing to step out of the pattern that had been created, where there's a German negotiator who's not negotiating and an Egyptian umbrella, and no negotiations were taking place. I knew a senior official in the Norwegian government who was an advisor to the Norwegian government on the Oslo peace process. I contacted him. He was in and out of the region all the time. I would meet with him when he came to Jerusalem. I asked him if the Norwegians would step in. Gave me the same answer. If we're the only ones, if we're appointed by both sides, we'd be willing to step in. The same with regard to the Turks. Hadass was this broken record. No way could I move forward. I felt deeply frustrated. I understood the frustration of the Shalit family, who knew that nothing was happening. We're waiting for an answer from Hamas. That's what they were being told all the time. I sent another letter to Gilad Shalit, this time through a personal friend who had gone to interview him for Jane's military magazine. This is kind of a funny story, and that's why I stuck the picture in. You know that Gilad Shalit had been almost assassinated by Israel on the streets of Amman by two Mossad guys. They had approached him on the streets of Amman and sprayed him with a chemical substance. He went into a coma. The two Mossad guys were picked up by the Jordanian police, and in order for Israel to negotiate the freedom of the two Mossad guys, they had to give the antidote to bring Gilad Shalit back to life, and Ahmed Yassin, the leader of Hamas, had been released from the Israeli prison and sent to Jordan. Well, Gilad Shalit has this phobia of Israelis and Israeli substances, and when my friend Mohammed Najib, at the end of their interview, said to him, "I have a letter from Gershon Baskin for you," and he took out the letter, Gilad Shalit stood up and put up his hands, "Don't let me touch that paper." So my friend Mohammed Najib took out the letter and read it to him, and of course Gilad Shalit's answer was their mantra: when Israel is serious about negotiations, we're willing to make a deal. We want to move forward. On July 4th, I received a letter from Razi Hamid, who called me, said he's sending me by email a text which is an offer to renew the negotiations. It was in fact a breakthrough letter suggesting that Hamas would renew the negotiations on the basis of the German proposal, and that the negotiations would be conducted in the same framework in which it was conducted in the past. Here we had an official Hamas response that they wanted to renew the negotiations. And I contacted Hadass and told him I have this letter, and I sent it to the Prime Minister's office, and the response I got back from Hadass was, "We have a German negotiator and a German track, don't interfere." And I said to him, "Chagai, we have a document from Hamas offering an opportunity to renew the negotiations. Look at it, talk to me." I spent 2 hours with him one evening, SMSing back and forth. I said to him, "Chagai, meet with me." He said, "Don't interfere, we have a German negotiator." I sent this letter to Ehud Barak, the Minister of Defense, and I said to him, "Ehud, you're the Minister of Defense. We're talking about a soldier. We need somebody, you are a former Prime Minister. We need a responsible adult who's going to take charge of this case now." I got back a letter from his Chief of Staff saying we sent the document to Chagai Hadass, the person responsible for the file in the Prime Minister's office. So it was a response of no all around. I spoke to friends who had been in the Mossad and knew Chagai Hadass and knew me well, and I asked them to speak to Chagai Hadass, and they came back with the answer, Hadass says there's a German track, we don't want interferences from anyone on the outside. Well, on January 3rd, I wrote in my weekly column in the Jerusalem Post a piece which I called The Forgotten Soldier, in which I said Gilad Shalit is not coming home. No one wants Gilad Shalit home. No one wants to empower Hamas. No one wants to give a victory to these terrorists. It would be better from Israel's point of view, as Netanyahu understands it, for Shalit to be forgotten, for him to come home as a dead hero, the Israeli soldier who went into battle to defend the country, died in battle, and came home in a coffin as a hero. Much better for Israel than having to pay the price of negotiating with terrorists and releasing terrorists from prison. This was what I believed. This is what I thought was going on. My sense was that Netanyahu had said, no, we are simply not negotiating this deal. How fortunate I was wrong. On January 25th, the Tahrir revolution in Cairo begins. 18 days later, Mubarak steps down. This is after the same thing happened in Tunisia. We have a new Middle East. In January 26th, the revolt begins in Syria. In March 15th, the Syrian opposition organizing revolts escalates. The Syrian regime attacks Palestinian refugee camps. The Palestinians, Hamas leadership in Damascus, makes a decision that they can no longer stay in Syria. They want out. They go to their friends in Tehran, and the Iranians say, come to Tehran. And Hamas says, well, that's not really what we want to do. And the Iranians say, well, we'll continue to support you with military, with weapons and with money, but you have to declare your support for Bashar al-Assad. And the Hamas leadership said, no, we can't do that. We can't support this leader who's butchering his own people. We can't stay. We're Sunnis. He's attacking Palestinians. We cannot stay there. The Hamas leadership turns to the Egyptians, and Mubarak is no longer there, and say, we want to relocate our bases of operation to Cairo. And the Egyptians, knowing that the Muslim Brotherhood is on the rise, has a new situation, and they say, you're welcome, but we have demands on you as well, and one of them is to finish the Gilad Shalit prisoner exchange deal, and we have a new situation. Hamas decides officially on their operation of leaving Syria. On August 15th, the Syrian forces attack the Palestinian refugee camp, intensifying the Hamas decision to leave. April 13th, Hadass resigns. In failure, tells the Prime Minister he wants to go into his private life again. I say, good riddance. April 18th, I hear on the news that David Maidan has been appointed to take over the file. I didn't know David Maidan. What I knew was reported in the news that he was a senior Mossad official, still in service at the rank of general, been appointed by Netanyahu to take over the position. I never heard of him before. I knew someone else who had been in the Mossad years before with the same family name, Pini Maidan. Between the period of Camp David in July 2000 till Taba in January of 2001, I had been a member of an Israeli-appointed experts committee on the future of Jerusalem to prepare Israel's negotiating position for the negotiations in Taba. And in the framework of that work that we did in the Prime Minister's office, I met Pini Maidan, who had been a foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Barak. I called up Pini and said, is David Maidan a relative of yours? He said, no. Why do you want to know? I said, it has to do with Gilad Shalit. He said, no problem. Do you want me to make contact with him for you? I said, yes, please. Half an hour later, I received a text message from Pini Maidan with David Maidan's phone number, who said, he's waiting for your call. I called up David Maidan. I introduced myself to him. I told him who I was, what I was doing, my 5 years of contacts with Hamas people. He said to me, I just got the position. I don't have an office, a desk, a secretary, a telephone. Give me 3 weeks and get back in touch with me. Well, during that 3-week period, I began texting him messages. I contacted the Hamas people and said, there's a new man in town. Let's try and get something started again. I contacted the Egyptians again and said, there's a new beginning. Let's try and do something. David told me later that during this 3-week period, which actually extended for another week, because Chagai Hadass was there and wouldn't leave. It took a month before Chagai Hadass would leave. But David Maidan told me what they were doing was what the intelligence people call clearing the noise from the room. They had offers of help and assistance from a lot of people, a lot of countries. Some of them quite serious. The most serious was a priest from the UK who had been delivering messages back and forth between Israel and Hamas in the past, and he offered his assistance. And there were other countries who said that they would be willing to step in and help. And there were all kinds of kooks and seance conveners and stargazers and coffee cup readers. And after they had cleaned out all the noise of the room, they were left with me. And David Maidan turned to his team and said to them, "What about this Baskin guy?" And the people on the team responded, "He's a peacenik." Peacenik, in other words, in Israel, that means a post-Zionist, an anarchist. How can we rely on someone like that? And David said, "We have nothing. There have been no negotiations taking place for 2 years. Nothing. Not a lead, not a string, nothing to grab onto. Has anyone in this room met the guy? Has anyone talked to him?" And of course the answer was no. And he said, "I'm going to test him." And he contacted me and asked me to deliver messages to Hamas. And I delivered those messages verbatim as I got them. And to his amazement, within an hour, he got a response.